Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, which is an update on the Cyber Essentials scheme. So we're assuming a bit of prior knowledge on Cyber Essentials as is about this webinar. Obviously, there are two schemes, as I'm sure you're aware, a self-assessed one and the externally assessed one. The changes do apply to both schemes, and they go live on the 24th of January. So there's a few things just to be aware of around this. So if you have an assessment in progress, it's going to continue to be to the previous standard, and you have 6 months from the date the new scheme starts to complete that previous assessment. If you're doing a plus assessment, you have to do that anyway within 3 months of your standard assessment certificate being issued. So if you have a standard assessment certificate issued at some point within the next 3 months based on the old standard, your plus assessment will be on the old standard as well. And finally, once your existing certificate has expired, if you're an existing Cyber Essentials certificate holder, the renewal will be to the new standard. So we're going to start today with the biggest change. So the major sort of elephant in the room really with Cyber Essentials has been for a long time that it hasn't covered cloud services. It's only covered devices that hold data. So cloud services that hold data, for instance, Microsoft 365, have not been within scope. So all that is about to change with the new release. So going forwards, all cloud services are now in scope. So that what's important here is what Cyber Essentials defines as a cloud service. So it's any cloud service, and they're talking about, apologies for the use of abbreviations here, software as a service. So that's basically a web application you might log on to, platform as a service. So that's something you might use within Azure, for instance, if you have that sort of technology, or infrastructure as a service, so cloud servers. Any of those types of service which hosts organization data. So thinking about that, the obvious one is something like Microsoft 365 or Google Workplace. However, you definitely extend that to the likes of CRM systems, ERP systems. You could even take it as far as being your company website as well. And what's really important to understand here is that you, as the applicant, are responsible for ensuring that the controls are implemented. So those controls might actually be outside of your control to put in place. So your cloud provider might be responsible for doing them as part of your agreement with them, and as part of the way they manage the software. But you are responsible for making sure the controls are in place and detailing that when you make your Cyber Essentials submission. So really, it's incumbent on you to find out from your cloud provider if the controls within the Cyber Essentials scheme have been put in place by them. A lot of cloud providers do publish that information. They publish it publicly quite often, but some of them, smaller providers, you might have to ask them. So user account controls. So these have always been in place with Cyber Essentials, but they've applied to devices only and not to cloud services. These user account controls are going to apply to cloud services as well. So that's having password policies in place for a certain number of characters. We'll come to that in a bit more detail later. Having processes to disable unused accounts. And the other one, the other thing that's not been present within Cyber Essentials on user accounts up until now is multi-factor authentication. I should say that from the 24th of January, this will apply to admin accounts only, subject to a few conditions. And from 2023 onwards, it will apply to user accounts as well. So the final important aspect of the controls on the cloud are that you should have separate admin accounts for any infrastructure as a service or cloud systems that offer authentication. So infrastructure as a service, as I said earlier, that's cloud servers. Cloud accounts offering authentication services. So Microsoft 365, Google Workspace both do this. So for instance, you can use Microsoft 365 to log on to lots of different applications, same as you can with Google. So what are the implications for organizations on this? The biggest problem I think most people are going to face is that cloud applications are very difficult to audit. So most businesses have asset registers of all their devices, or they have some kind of monitoring system that collects that information automatically. It's relatively straightforward to audit, possibly a little more tricky for mobiles and tablets. However, with cloud services, it's far more difficult to accomplish. You often have, especially in larger organizations, cloud services may be purchased on a departmental level, and central IT might not be aware necessarily that they're in use. So particularly as you start to scale, the only really sensible way to accomplish this is to use some form of cloud auditing software, and there is some technology out there that can do that. It's also possible that more devices will come into scope. So previously on the old scheme, cloud services were often accessed outside the organization by contractors or people using personal devices. Because the data was locked down into the cloud and couldn't be downloaded on those devices weren't in scope. Unfortunately now, they are in scope, so any device that is used to access the cloud service containing organizational data is within scope. So if, for instance, you're using Office 365, you've got it locked down to be accessible via a web browser only, and all the data is enclosed in that. If someone accesses that data from a non-business device or a non-company device, that device is still in scope. And that issue also extends out to any sort of third parties you might have managing your cloud systems. So if you have someone logging on from a software company that supports you, their devices will be in scope as well. So as an organization, we're going to have to make sure that those businesses also have Cyber Essentials compliant devices. So basically, they're Cyber Essentials certified in order for you to be comfortable that you can say that all devices are to a Cyber Essentials standard. Just some implications for staff. Obviously, they're using personal devices. They'd probably be unhappy with an organization managing those and controlling them. And you're going to get a lot more requirement for multi-factor authentication. Some people might not be happy using personal devices for that. Multi-factor authentication, if you're not familiar with it, will usually use text message or an app on your phone to access it, both of which require a mobile. If someone doesn't have a company mobile, then obviously the only way to achieve that is with a personal one. There are some alternatives. There's a technology called YubiKeys, which can do this without the use of a mobile. So moving on to the next major change, these are controls around home working. So one of the bigger challenges with the previous standard on Cyber Essentials was that it was quite difficult to apply the controls for home working. In actual fact, the people running the Cyber Essentials scheme have put a sort of temporary relaxation in place on the home working standards to allow organisations to still achieve it in the current kind of scenario we're in with lots of home and hybrid workers. So those changes are being made permanent now, and in the new scheme, firstly, anyone that works from home at any time or any amount of time is now considered to be a home worker. So it does expand the scope quite significantly for home workers. The device they're using at home, whether they're accessing the cloud or any of your servers, whatever it is, those devices are in scope. That's not really a surprise considering what we just talked about with the new controls around cloud. Now that device, and this is important, it must have a software firewall enabled, and that firewall must be subject to all the other Cyber Essentials firewall controls. So there's a bunch of questions on firewalls. They're in the old standard, they're in the new one. Tablets and mobiles are exempt from that, but all PCs, for example, will be subject to that control, whether it's a Windows PC, a Mac, or a Linux, or whatever it is. You can run a VPN from your home device, or the device you're using to work from home, I should say, to a company firewall. That removes the need for a software firewall. And here's the really important part, and I think a lot of organisations will be quite relieved at this one. Home routers are not owned by the organisation, so basically your internet provider's router that's usually installed in most people's homes, they are now out of scope. They used to be in scope, which was a really tricky control to deal with. They're now out of scope. So implications for business. Generally speaking, it's going to make things a bit easier for organisations because of this, mostly because of this requirement that home routers are now out of scope. Software firewalls, you will probably need some central controls. It's very difficult, particularly you imagine you've got 100 people working from home. You're not going to be able to control the standards and all those firewalls in a practical way without some sort of central way of managing them. Now, most organisational and business IT systems have got ways of controlling those, so that shouldn't be a major issue. Obviously, all devices need to be managed, but I'm just going to make a cautionary note on this one. So, this relaxation on home working controls, it's been done really because what the people running the Cyber Essentials scheme didn't want to do was make it unachievable for most businesses, and that's kind of where we've got to now with the number of people working from home. It was really difficult if you've got 75% of your business working from home to put a company firewall in each of those. It's really costly. The management overhead is high. So they specifically relaxed this control to make Cyber Essentials more achievable than it would otherwise have been had it been left in there. And they judge this to be kind of the lesser of two evils, really. So it should be said that from a security perspective, home working is still risky because you as an organisation have no control over the home network, and therefore making sure that you've got the right level of security on home workers, such as having good security monitoring of the devices, the right anti-malware in place, and using VPNs if you've got particularly sensitive information on them. These controls are all still highly recommended, even if potentially the scheme has been relaxed a bit. So again, now move on to user accounts. This is the other major area of change. So I mentioned that multi-factor authentication now was coming in as a requirement. So user and admin accounts, there's got to be one of a few different controls on there. So firstly, what they really want to see in Cyber Essentials is that you're using multi-factor authentication. As I said, it's a requirement on admin accounts now, if it's available, or on user accounts, it's a recommendation that will become a requirement in 2023. If you can't use multi-factor authentication, then you need controls on guest passwords, at least to stop what's known as brute force attacks. So throttling the number of attempts or locking accounts after a number of unsuccessful attempts. And this one's a bit of a killer, but if you're not using multi-factor authentication, a minimum password length of 12 characters, or at least 8 characters, and using common password blocking technology. So that technology isn't available in all applications. I believe it is available within Windows now, or at least within the Microsoft 365 way of logging onto Windows. 12 characters for a password isn't really practical for most people to remember, or maybe using the sort of three-word guidance, using the three-word guidance from the National Cybersecurity Centre, you might get around it, but still it's going to be quite tricky to have lots of different passwords, all with 12 characters in, unless you're using a password manager. Right, so this applies to most elements of your IT network as well. I've put a long list there. One of the things it doesn't apply to, though, and there's a change here, and this is actually something that's going to improve the end user experience a bit, and often these security controls don't improve it, as they have the opposite effect. But device PIN codes. So a device PIN code is something that unlocks the actual device itself, but not the account behind it. So the obvious example of this is something like a mobile phone. That's a PIN code. It unlocks a device, but it's not unlocking. It's not a code to unlock your business account on your Windows system. Likewise, you can get PIN codes on Windows PCs. It unlocks the PC itself, but it's not a gateway to the system, and the actual password is usually encrypted on the device. So those used to follow the same rules as passwords, 8 digits. That's now been dropped down to 6 digits. So organizational implications, this is obviously driving use of multi-factor authentication. I know a lot of businesses are doing this anyway. It doesn't prevent password reuse, which is one of the biggest risks around passwords. So using the same password in multiple systems, but the multi-factor authentication does reduce that risk a bit. Obviously, if you've got your staff entering multi-factor authentication code for everything they sign on to, it's probably going to be a bit of a hit in productivity. So you should consider looking at single sign-on wherever you can to try and mitigate that. I've already mentioned about using staff using personal devices and the issues with long passwords as well. So just finishing up with a few other points about the updates. So Cyber Essentials Plus. Cyber Essentials Plus follows the same standard as Cyber Essentials, but actually what they do is it's an actual test. So there's someone physically testing it. So they've added a couple of additional checks in. So there's some checks on user and admin account separation. So basically checking that you're not using admin accounts for day-to-day use. And there's checks on multi-factor authentication for cloud accounts as well. There's also been a tightening on software patching. Without getting into details, it means that there were some sort of workarounds on some of the patching that allowed you to get away with not applying every single update, every single security update. Essentially now, without going into the technical details of it, really you have to apply every single security update within 14 days of release to every piece of software. And if the software isn't supported and there's no security updates, then you've got to essentially put it on a computer that's not connected to the internet and separated from your network. And finally, thin clients. If you use thin clients for accessing remote desktops or virtual desktops, these have been outside of the scope before. They're now coming into scope from January next year, and it means that they'll need to have security updates and operating system updates put on them as well. That might be tricky to achieve for some organizations because thin clients are quite difficult to manage. Usually the reason they're deployed is because you can lock them so they effectively reset themselves every time they're powered off. That won't be acceptable anymore. You'll have to have some way of managing them. Often it requires specialist software or more powerful thin clients. So it's just something to think about. You've got a little while yet because that's not for a year. Just a couple of final points. You can't pick and choose the assessment. So if you're getting assessed on the old standard, that's the standard your network should be to. If you're getting assessed on the new standard, that's the standard you should be working towards. If you're currently in progress with an assessment, obviously, unless you want to stop that and start again with the new standard, the best thing is to progress through that assessment and then put together a plan for how you're going to get up to standard for when you renew that assessment in 12 months' time. So you've got plenty of time to do it, but as I mentioned, the cloud side of things can be tricky, so it's worth starting that early. And really, you should expect these assessments to take a bit longer than they were before, just because you've got all this cloud element to deal with. So there's a few areas you can get some more resources, some information on this on the internet. As I said, these slides will go out, so you'll be able to find that information on them. So that concludes the update. We've got a couple of questions, I think. There was a question about whether you need, on the user accounts, I think this is, whether multi-factor authentication and throttling is required, or multi-factor authentication and minimum password length. So I believe what it is that if you have multi-factor authentication, an 8-digit password on its own is fine. If you don't have multi-factor authentication, you need some way of, I'd say throttling passwords, but basically limiting password or guess password. So locking out after, I think it's 10 attempts, or having a period of time before when you can re-enter those passwords. So if you've got multi-factor authentication, the previous standard of 8-digit passwords is fine. If you don't have multi-factor authentication, you need to put the other controls in place, and that's the minimum password length and the lockout after a certain number of attempts, or delaying until you can retry. And there's another one about mobiles here. So please can you advise the best method to check that personal mobiles used to make work calls or log on to emails are on the latest update. So yeah, so if you want to have controls around your mobile phones, there's a number of ways to do it. You can check on them manually and check that your staff are, if these are personal mobiles, if your staff are complying with your company policy, which might be a written document. Now, that can work if you've got a small number of mobiles, but as you'd imagine, as you scale the numbers up, it becomes more and more difficult to do. So once you get to that point, you need to look at some kind of system to at least provide some level of management on personal mobiles. You can control that at the app level. So if you either deploy a secure app or a set of secure apps where the controls are on the apps themselves. However, that doesn't stop the controls around the mobile being required. So it gives you a certain level of control because you've got some passwords there. But on top of that, you've got the requirements around software and software being kept up to date on mobiles. Essentially, unless you've got some monitoring software installed on your phones, you're not going to be able to technically monitor that. So you will just need to do regular checks with your staff. It's worth saying that Cyber Essentials is a one-off check or one-off assessment, a point-in-time assessment. So to get the certificate and to pass, you only need to do this once a year. But obviously that sort of defeats the point of it. So you're going to want to be checking in every so often. So the best way of doing it is to put the controls on the apps with passwords, so your organizational data is secured. Then to have a written policy that you get your staff to sign and to revisit that every so often to make sure people are following that policy. And those things should be, they're not installing apps that fall outside your app policy, which might just be you're allowing apps from the App Store, but no kind of apps that don't come into it, that they're updating the operating system on the phone, and that they're updating all the apps on it as well. So it is an overhead, and really the best way of dealing with it is to provide company mobiles to everyone, but obviously that doesn't necessarily work well with all organisations or your staff potentially if they've got to carry two phones around. So it's not an easy one, and there's no magic bullet, unfortunately, for dealing with it. Right, so there's another question here saying, Cyber Essentials process, self-assessment stays the same. Is it still based on honest answers with no level of challenge? So, yeah, I mean, this is one of the things about Cyber Essentials, the basic level. You could, if you had the knowledge, respond to it, make up all the answers, and then submit it and get your certificate. Obviously, that kind of defeats the point of doing it. Because one of the reasons for doing this is to be secure, not just to get a certificate. Although some people might do that because they need it to bid some work or something. What I will say is that it is actually quite difficult because the assessment standards are quite high to get a pass on the Cyber Essentials if you aren't working with someone who understands exactly what the assessors are looking for. Because they are quite specific about what's required in order to give you a pass. So you'll probably find, and IASME, who run the Cyber Essentials scheme, have been putting quite a lot of work into ensuring that all the assessors, certification bodies out there meet a certain quality standard and that they're going to scrutinise assessments properly. So yes, there may not be any audit of the basic level of Cyber Essentials, but unless you're working with someone who understands what's required, it's going to be quite difficult to get the certificate anyway. And the likelihood is that if you're working with someone who knows what's required, then they would probably have gone through the quality assessment process and therefore not submit a questionnaire or not sign off a questionnaire where they're not confident that the controls are being met. Obviously, the plus side of things does check some of the controls as well. So thank you very much for attending. I hope it was useful use of your time, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks. Bye.